The city's been quiet lately. Maybe my luck's finally changing.
Spider-Man 2 is an open-world action game that was developed by Treyarch, published by Activision, and released on the PS2, Xbox and Gamecube in June of 2004. The game is a tie-in to the summer blockbuster of the same name. It was received almost as well as the movie, and even went on to sell 2 million copies within its first few months. Like most movie-based games, the plot plays out like an extended version of the film. It touches on most of the same points, but there are bits of stories and a host of characters thrown into the game to help bulk things out a little. The main narrative thread of the game is just like the film. It follows Peter Parker, who has now been Spider-Man for a couple of years and is struggling to balance his real life with his crime fighting, and the story also covers the origin of Dr. Octopus. Now, the movie was one of the most popular pieces of cinema of its decade, so I'm going to assume that there is a solid chance you've seen it, or at least know how it all plays out. There isn't really anything new here, it's just a retelling of those events. The only difference between the two is the delivery of dialogue, which we'll touch on later.
Peter, I think you should know. I'm seeing someone now. A guy.
Oh. Really? Huh.
Open-world superhero games are pretty common today, but back in 2004, not so much, and in this game you can swing around the city as you please, climb all of the buildings you want, and even pick up a bunch of collectibles. If you want to progress, however, you'll have to work through the chapters by completing certain objectives, such as taking photos for the Daily Bugle, preventing a certain amount of crimes around the city, and generally just doing the whole Spider-Man thing. It's a slightly repetitive loop, not so much that you'll want to stop playing, but you'll want to rush through the forced side activities, but luckily they're all tasks that can be finished in less than 2 minutes most of the time. The story-based missions provide a little break from the monotony, as they usually result in a showdown between you and a more well-known character like Rhino, Black Cat or Mysterio. The good thing is that it's not all punches and kicks. Some bosses you have to evade and counter, some bosses you have to chase through the city, and some bosses you have to compete against in weird game show-like competitions.
Call me freak!
This particular Spider-Man game is quite an interesting one, as it's the first to implement a physics-based swinging mechanic that has been tweaked and tinkered with over the years, but is still kind of the same swinging system you see today. Older Spider-Man games would have him swinging from thin air, but this game introduced a system that caused the webbing to actually attach to buildings and objects. So instead of swinging in a straight line like the old games, you have to navigate the city of New York by sticking close to the structures and using momentum to your advantage. I have to admit that it was quite the learning curve jumping back into this version of the mechanic, and it shows just how far these games have come over the years, because for a good chunk of time I was bumping into buildings a lot. This doesn't mean it's bad, it's simply the first version of this realistic system, and with that comes a little bit of awkwardness, but considering this game was most likely made in a rush like most movie titles, it deserves some praise that it even works at all. The other element of this crime fighting game is the crime fighting. You'll get into plenty of scraps with bank robbers, carjackers, and a variety of thugs and criminals throughout the city. You have an attack button, a grapple/dodge button, and a web button. Once again, this feels like an early version of a system that would be improved upon in later games. You can tell by the way the enemy AI surrounds you that it's trying to force you into a rhythm of dodging attacks, throwing some punches yourself, and keeping people at bay with your webbing. Also, to give you a further advantage, you do have your spider sense ability, which is basically bullet time. You can slow things down for a few seconds and get some extra hits in, but it does mean having to put up with a blurry filter over the screen that doesn't help at all. As you progress, your ability to punch people in the face and swing through the city of New York will improve. Over the course of the campaign, you'll collect hero points which can be spent to upgrade things like swinging speed or new combat abilities such as longer combos and new techniques. This doesn't elevate the game to any great heights, but it is a nice addition to help keep things fresh towards the tail end. One element that did catch me by surprise was the visuals. Obviously, we all remember some of our favourite games through a bit of a nostalgic lens, but boy, this game doesn't look too great when you're up close. In all honesty, this is forgivable because, you know, it's a movie game that clearly decided to focus on its groundbreaking mechanic as its selling point, but talking to some of the civilians and exploring the city on ground level is a bit of an eye-opener. On the positive side, the New York skyline looks perfectly fine from the top of the building, models of the main characters look decent enough, and although the animation can look a little odd, it's not distractingly bad. Like many games of this era, the sound design isn't anything to write home about. Most of the sound effects are standard fare with slightly comical sounding punches and kicks, and there is also a soundtrack that isn't terrible but doesn't feel in keeping with the movie that the game is based on. The real audio blemish is the voice acting. Even though Tobey Maguire and others got into the recording booth for this one, a lot of lines sound like they were recorded in one take.
Bug? Harry, I know you think Spider-Man killed your dad.
He did kill my dad. Someday I'll get him for it too. Tell him that next time you see him.
Yeah, well...
The main takeaway for me after playing this game is that the biggest problem is just that time just hasn't been kind to it. At one point it would have been considered revolutionary, but in a more modern context it comes across a little more clunky and rough around the edges. The open world does offer you plenty of things to do, you just might not want to do it all, as the main missions are fun, but the mandatory side missions get old fast. There's an argument to make that this is the best Spider-Man game from this generation. If you're not a fan, then this is of course a much harder game to recommend, but if you're as fond of the movies as I am, then this is a flawed but fun shot of nostalgia.